From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our very exciting Valentine's Day event, Tour Palabra, the Art of Ekphrasis. My name is Rob Casper. I'm head of the Poetry and Literature Center, and I'm delighted to see you all here today on a beautiful post-storm day. We're all happy to be up here. Our presenters have come from a long way and dealt with many trains and airplanes to get here. So this event is co-sponsored by the Hispanic Division at the Library of Congress. And I would like to thank the Chief of the Hispanic Division, George, for helping make this event possible. I would also like to thank Letras Latinas, the literary program of the Institute of Latino Studies of the University of Notre Dame, and our presenting partner. And in particular, I would like to thank Francisco Aragon. Where's Francisco? There's Francisco. We owe a great debt of gratitude to Francisco for his historic efforts to champion Latino writers across the country with public programs such as this one this afternoon. Before we begin, I need to ask you to turn off your cell phones or any other electronic devices you have that might interfere with today's program. I also want to let you know that this program will be audio and video broadcast. And by participating in the question and answer session, you give the Library of Congress permission for future use of these recordings. And let me tell you about my home here at the Library of Poetry and Literature Center. We are the home of the Poet Laureate Consultant of Poetry, and we put on literary readings, lectures, and panels like this throughout the year. If you would like to find out more about events like this, you can sign our sign-up sheet outside, and you can pick up our brochure. You can also check us out on the web at www.loc.gov/poetry. And you can check out the library's Hispanic division at www.loc.gov/rr/Hispanic. I also want to let you know that we will soon be putting up interviews with U.S. Hispanic writers on the library's website to celebrate the Hispanic Division's archive of recorded Hispanic literature on tape. And in the not too distant future, we will have recordings from that collection and from the archive of recorded poetry and literature. So be sure to check out our websites. You'll get a sense of all the programs that we've done, like this one, and the programs that the Hispanic Division and the Poetry and Literature Center have done over the course of the past 75 years promoting poetry and literature. Now on to today's event. You can read more about our two presenters, Brenda Cardenas and Valerie Martinez, in your print program, which should be on your seat. I want to give a special thanks to them both for traveling through challenging conditions. Valerie herself had to switch flights and fly into Philly yesterday and take a train from there late last night, so she arrived this morning. And the program will go as follows. Brenda and Valerie will both give presentations with slides, as you can see, and read poetry. And then Catalina Gomez from the Hispanic Division, who's sitting right here manning the slide computer, will follow with a moderated discussion. We will leave some time at the end of the program for your questions. And we also hope that you will purchase books by both of our presenters, which are for sale right in the back, and have them signed afterwards. So without further ado, please welcome our readers.
Okay, shall we begin? Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and being here. I know it was probably a struggle for some people to to get here. So we thought, Valerie and I thought that perhaps the best way to talk about this phenomenon of ekphrasis would be through examples of different kinds of approaches that poets have taken to ekphrasis. But just to begin, some definitions. There are a number of different scholars, critics who've written theory on ekphrasis and criticism on it, and one of the most well-known is James Hefferman. And Hefferman starts with a derivation of that term ekphrasis, ek which it means out, and phrasen, tell, declare, or pronounce. And so he goes from there to creating his definition of ekphrasis, which is the verbal representation of a visual representation. Other scholars, Elizabeth Lassou being one of them, just says that an ekphrastic poem is one that addresses a work of art. And from there, in the criticism, we have a lot of other, Barbara Fisher, Michael Benton, Mitchell, W.J.T. Mitchell, who add to that various levels and layers and nuances that maybe we'll get to talk about when we do the Q&A. Some of that will come out. But I thought it might be best, again, we thought it would be best to do this through examples. So we're going to start with an ekphrastic poem by the poet Juan Felipe Herrera, who is actually the poet laureate of California right now. And this is the image by Artemio Rodriguez that Juan Felipe was writing in response to. And the poem is called La Campana. La Campana. Say, baby, so I got a job. Yeah. No more cheese lines, no more dead quesadillas, mango flakes, or Blintz wannabes. See me? Hey, don't pity me, Jack. I am on. That's right, I am on. Every day I strike up the hours, time, space, matter, the mystery. They snap at my command. They do the bump and blues. What more can anyone ask? You want to know how long you got to live? You want to know about the last homicide, the rice festival, the grimace inside this building? Listen up. So that's the poem. And this is the image that poem was written in response to. Exactly. So both the poem and the image can be found side by side in an entire collection of these pairings between this poet and this artist. And the book is called Loteria Cards and Fortune Poems, A Book of Lives. And we decided to begin with this one because of the way that it demonstrates what we feel is one of the most common approaches that poets take to ekphrasis, and that is to invoice a figure in the artwork, what critics call prosopoeia, and construct a narrative situation for that figure, thereby essentially becoming a persona poem. That's what he's ultimately writing here. And while the poem takes this kind of more traditional approach to ekphrasis, I think it does so in unexpected ways, and you did too, right? Because you said that's for this slide. So Artemio Rodriguez's print, right? If we look at the print, what it's doing is depicting a contemporary kind of surreal spin on the La Campana card from the Mexican Loteria game. And you can see the game here. The Loteria game is a game of chance, which is similar in ways to bingo in the United States, but it utilizes images of objects and their names rather than numbers, and it's often used to teach children vocabulary. Whole families play it, it's very popular. Rodriguez's more macabre version of this Loteria card personifies the bell's clacker, and it surrounds the bell's clacker with other bizarre characters. Herrera's poem picks up on this cue, but moves far beyond description to lend multiple nuances to the clacker's personality and story. He crafts a slick, hip voice for the clacker, using references and diction which bring the narrative fully into the present. And to the reader's surprise, despite the image's allusions to what I think are, public lynchings and beheadings or ethnological exhibitions, we might see all of those allusions in that print. Herrera's clacker is quite the optimist, empowered by his recent acquisition of gainful employment, dealing in the mysteries of time. And I mean that, or is he, right? The poem's final line alludes to the grimaces on the clacker's own face and on the other faces of the characters that surround him in the church tower. And that kind of led me, when I was reading the poem, to question that bravado in the clacker's speech and to ask what innuendo that might belie, and if he is indeed a reliable narrator. So when I read Herrera's poem, beside Rodriguez's print, I'm first surprised by the tone, and the mood, and the diction, and the narrative situation that the voice establishes, and then I become further intrigued by the potential ambiguities in the poem's message and interpretation of the artwork. So for me, Herrera's response to Rodriguez's print is as idiosyncratic and as mysterious, or you might say, some people might say as quirky, as is the print's response to the original Loteria card. And this is one of the elements of this particular project, this Loteria Cards and Fortune poems, that I really appreciate. That's what I appreciate about it. So again, this approach was in voicing a figure within the artwork.
Isn't that lovely? Yes. So this is the poem I'm going to read is Lucy Brock-Broido. It's called Lady with an Ermine. It's from her book Trouble in Mind, 2013. It's a very short poem, so I'm actually going to read it twice. In the snow, white noise, a gathering of foxes, oddly standing still in the milk broth of oblivion. In the keep at Castle Strange, an ermine in the shape of an ermine animal, but empty, slung over the carved oak chair, carelessly and keeping no one warm. In the snow, white noise, a gathering of foxes, oddly standing still in the milk broth of oblivion. In the keep at Castle Strange, an ermine in the shape of an ermine animal, but empty, slung over the carved oak chair, carelessly, and keeping no one warm. So this approach to ekphrasis is actually, the poet actually moves to the story behind the story. In the poem, we don't have a description of the young maiden with this ermine-looking pet in her arms, right? The poet leaps to the backstory. And the backstory is the reality of ermines, which are weasels, if you don't know. They only have a white coat in winter. They're hunted in winter. And there are the foxes, right, in the poem. The foxes, who are the predators, who hunt the ermines, are standing in this field, a white oblivion like the ermines, right, who are meeting their oblivion. And the poem has the phrase white noise, right? And the poem is the white noise, right? Behind the image is the reality of these ermines hunted in winter. And then the second half of the poem, this image of the fur, right? The pelt of the ermine hung over a chair carelessly, keeping no one warm. So they're hunted, but the woman who wears the ermine to be fashionable or warm, she can wear it, she can not wear it. It's hung over the chair. It really doesn't mean that much. But the most interesting thing to me, I was saying earlier, I sort of been thinking about in the last week, is look at the image. They're looking toward a light, right? As if a door is opened. And her gaze to me is gentle. But the animal seems to me a little bit alert. Just a tiny bit, do you see that? Maybe a little bit wary. The animal is white, it's winter. It would be hunted. So I noticed in the last couple of weeks, hers is a gentle alertness. Who's coming through the door? But the ermine, a little bit alert. And maybe this is the thing that prompted Lucy Brock-Broido, the little bit of tenuousness into the story behind the story.
Okay. Oops. No? Is that the next one?
Is it? I'll do the next
I
one.
thought it was Cunha. That's okay.
So this one, the poem I'm going to read for you is Eduardo Corral from a book called Slow Lightning that won the Yale Series of Younger Poets in 2010, I think. The poem is called My Hands Are My Heart, the same title as the image. The poem is numbered 1 through 36, so each line I read you has a number. 1. Often, I catch him playing doctor with his shadow. 2. Por arriba, por abajo. 3. With duct tape he mends his favorite jeans. 4. The way stubble salts his chin. 5. A saxophone is nothing like an ampersand in his hands. 6. Hound and brass bound. 7. Above his mattress there's a poster of a Ferris wheel. 8. Ripped jeans, paint-streaked boots. 9. Las tardes aquellas. 10. In his wallet, a fake driver's license. 11. Plumed initials. 12. To make an animal out of tenderness. 13. Aztec, Trekkie, AZT. 14. To run through the corridors of a corrido. 15. Like bitter water, like burning water. 16. Que jale. 17. The way the light touches him like a priest. 18. Thumb to chin, thumb to forehead. 19. Doo-wah, doo-wah. 20. He believes a pomegranate is a thesaurus. 21. Each seed a synonym for the color red. 22. Garnet, puce, claret. 23. To dig a little in this world. 24. Like the song-limbed. 25. His mouth is nothing like a cup. 26. Impossible to drink from, impossible to shatter. 27. Pero que necesidad. 28. After a meal, he plucks a cigarillo from his pocket. 29. Though rain collects in the small of his back. 30. Even music can bleed. 31. To crash a quinceañera just for the quesadillas. 32. Codo, baboso, pendejo. 33. Sometimes I gather the vowels in his last name. 34. Acquired. Acquired. 35. He carries the scent of musk around like a musket. 36. My Minuteman. So what happened here? Right. So the poem, right, the photos really are just prompts, right? Again, is this a backstory? No, a little bit different. So the poem, again, does not describe the clay heart revealed, right, in the second photo. There is a lot of body in the poem, right? So the body evokes that. But instead of the subject of the photographs, we have the lover in the poem, the lover's body, right, in the poem, enumerated. And if my hands are my heart in this poem, my pen is my heart. Here are the 37 ways in which I love, right, this body, this person, the lover, enumerated. And really what's so interesting to me is we have this long tradition in painting of the odalisque, right, the nude body, the male painter often, the female nude. Here we have an odalisque in a way, but it is, we understand sort of, if the poet speaker, we assume I do for some reason, is a man, we have the male gazer and the male body, perhaps democratized in a way that there's a lot of controversy over the odalisque of the male gaze, right, and the kind of appropriation of the woman nude. But in here, it is not the body image in the photographs, but the more intimate poet, speaker, lover's body, which is quite interesting to me. And then one of the things that we also get is a very strong sense of the identity of that lover, but done sort of creatively, right? We know who this person is. Aztec, Trekkie, AZT, right? That wonderful, I think, 3-noun line that tells us about that. about who this lover is, as well as some particularities, the cigarillo, the paint-streaked boots, and as well as personality. It is a love poem, codo, baboso, pendejo, crashing the quinceañera for the quesadillas, right? An intimate kind of love poem, a particular body, a particular personality. And at the same time, we have all these references to song and to music, right? So the poem as a kind of love song keeps like a stitch coming up in the list of things. Here, this approach is, in some ways, the work of art just is a place for leaping off for the poet to create a kind of biography of the lover, enumerated, a song. My hands are my heart. This is how I love him.
Next, I'm going to present two very short poems by Cecilia Vicuña. I think it's important to know something about her work. Vicuña is a textile, assemblage, installation, and performance artist, as well as a poet. And much of her writing is meant to be declaimed aloud. So there's an oral element that's important to it, as well as visual ones. For print publication, she often photographs her own artworks, many of which are very ephemeral installations and earthworks. And then she either overlays the photos with the poems or prints the poems beneath or alongside the photos, as you can see here. This is how it was printed in the book. And paying close attention to their layout and their typography. And in this sense, the poems perform visually on the page. They're very intertextual in and of themselves. Her poems often incorporate quotations from myriad sources, including orally transmitted ones, as well as the etymologies of words in multiple languages. Her works layer and juxtapose images of knots, nets, strings, and ropes, encircling disjointed elements of the warp and the weft, constellations, entanglements, and weavings to treat larger themes such as interconnection. We see the theme of interconnection running throughout all of her books, all of her work, and we see the weaving. We see the warp and the weft returning and returning. So the following two pieces come from her book titled Key Poem, which is a play on the word quipu. And a quipu is the Andean system of intricately knotted cords that's used to store information significant to Andean culture and civilization. And we can leave it that one.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Leave it at that one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the first one, Cruz del Sur. Cross is the south. Is the cross south? A constellation of darkness, another of light, a gesture to be completed by light. The flickering lights produce the trance, and a gleam in the dark is seminal. Vicuña includes in her book an end note, not anywhere near this page, at the end of the book, about this piece that says, the Southern Cross, a constellation that points to the South Pole as it moves across the sky, the jewel box shining brightly, and the coal sack, a dark patch in the Milky Way. Quechua astronomy saw the dark spaces between the stars as dark constellations. So she gives you that end note if you turn to it to read it. The Southern Cross photograph that you see here in the slide documents but one element of a larger installation she did that she titled La Bodega Negra, or Barn Yarn, in which the sun's rays penetrated through circular holes bored into the dilapidated roof of an old barn. And they projected points of light in this dark interior of the barn, which contained, the barn also contained threads that were tacked to the stone wall, sacks, other agricultural implements or apparatus, and then the artist's own body. So if you could go to the next slide. This is the other piece of hers that we included, and this is titled Sendero Chipcha. The sun spins the thread of life around the world. The earth is a loom, and the sun weaves the night and the day. The Chipchas weave lines, birds lose feathers, and bean makes its offering to immensity. 2 or 3 lines, a mark, and silence begins to speak. So that's the text that you see strung there. All of the examples of all of the examples that we're showing you today, these 2 may be the furthest from any sense of traditional ekphrasis, traditional notions of ekphrasis. Definitely if we think of it as a verbal representation of a visual representation. It's impossible to neatly categorize Vicuña's works because we might call this ekphrasis, but we could just as easily call this a visual poem. We could call this an image text. We could call this a performance documentary. Or we could simply call it a work of visual art that happens to incorporate text in it. It's hard to say. And yet, we see in these examples that the textual elements correspond to or converse with or collaborate with the visual elements. There is a sense that the poems came after the visual works and were not essential to their first iteration, but are integral to this particular iteration in this book. What I find most interesting about the poems in these particular works are their references to mark making as bodily gestures engaged in the process of becoming. The boundaries are not between visual art making, writing, and speaking, but are instead between pre and post gesture, between pre and post utterance. And that's one of the things that, it sends me back to Vicuña's work over and over and over again. Oh,
No?
yeah, no, you were right.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. Okay. Sorry.
So here's the painting by Amy Silman, and here is the poem by Monica Fambrau. And the title of the poem is Don't You Think Salt is Pretty? I put my mouth on the canvas. What is bare is inviting. Very curved drain of the sink-like exposed. We stare and stare at the arm in a sling. You turn to me with your mouth full of ashes and your pan full of eggs. And I look at you with my 2 black bullet holes and my mouth full of eyeshadow. I start to say something, and blue shampoo pours out of my eyes and glistens my hands. A pumpkinful of lava upturned on the table must have been the centerpiece. Which of these islands behind my eyelids have you been to, and which were you born on again? We are coached. I with my eyesight projecting my buttery heart into you. I am not comfortable either. So what I'm going to say is that this approach to ekphrasis is that the work of art is what Elizabeth Loiseau, she has a book called 20th Century Poetry and the Visual Arts. She says there's one type that's called tutelary. It's a teaching, right? The work of art teaches something. And here, the poet-speaker reads a story into the painting, which I'll talk about, and the story is somehow reflective of the speaker's personal story. So the poem evokes the relationship between this I and you, right? In the poem, I and you and a we. And it's an uncomfortable domesticity, right? She even says at the end, I am not comfortable either. Something's not quite right in this domestic situation, I'm thinking, in the poem and in the painting. And the domesticity in the poem, there are sinks and pans and eggs and butter and eyeshadow and centerpieces, accompanied by slings and ashes and bullet holes and things upturned on tables and lava, right? We hear that in the poem. So look at that painting. It is uncomfortable, is it not? There's that big smudge of gray in the painting, something or someone maybe being rubbed out. And the suggested motion of the figure, see that on the bottom right with that movement of the green, as if moving to a race or moving toward a door, a kicking out, maybe a fist raised. This makes the speaker and the you uncomfortable, despite the buttery heart in the last stanza of the poem. Maybe the painting's coaching them. Is there something in the painting and something about us? Is there an echo here? Right? We feel that in the poem or hear it. What's fascinating to me about the painting is the poem and the painting. In the poem, there are all these eyes and mouths, right, mentioned over. Are there any in the painting? No eyes, no mouths, void of that. So interesting. So in that case, ekphrasis gives a presence to something that's, I think, kind of markedly absent in the poem. The painting is powerfully silent, even blind, while the poem speaks and bores with those bullet holes. The poem gives the painting sight and speech, but it's not the kind of sight or speech that makes us comfortable.
Okay. This piece, the painting is by Richard Diebenkorn, as you can see. It's titled Ochre, 1983. And the poem I'm going to read to you was written by Sharon Dolan, and she gave the poem the same title, Ochre. Whatever was first there may continue to exist. You can still make out fugitive pinks and blues, saved by white diagonal, and the stucco house with trellis trailing woodbine until midsummer glare intervenes. I've given you two ideas, forethought and afterthought, overlaid by a Venetian green door. You are mistaken if you think I planned it this way. Only by being mistaken about diagonal rows beside powder blue could I hope to swathe all in honey. Live life not as one grand mistake, but as shards of thousands with time to cover the bruise. Play with the watermark, pull down an ochre shade, and let the shapes, once removed, move you. And you see the poem is also paying attention to visuality, right? The visual, the layout on the page and the space on the page. This poem comes from Dolan's book titled Serious Pink, and that book consists of 3 sections. Each contains a set of ekphrastic poems on one of 3 artists. So this poem is from the section where there's a number of poems on different Diebenkorn paintings. And then there's a section on paintings by Joan Mitchell, and there's a 3rd section on pieces by Howard Hodgkins. What I find most compelling about Dolan's approach to ekphrasis is the attention that she gives to the surface of the artwork, of the painting, and to the process of the artist. We see that come up over and over again in the poem, as well as to how she incorporates these observations then that she makes about the process of the artist and about the surface of the painting into larger extended metaphors. In this case, about the nature of mistakes, what they might do for art and for life. So that aspect that I think of it is also that tutelary function that Valerie just spoke about, that Lassus talks about, that delivering the image's lesson, right? In Ochre, I'm drawn to the manner in which Dolan moves back and forth from general observations that might apply to many different aspects of life, including the painting, to specific references to the painting's surface, including its underpainting, its pentimenti, which is that reappearance of the underlying image that she speaks of in lines like, whatever was first there may continue to exist. In this painting, with its pentimenti, and obviously also in life. And lines like, I've given you 2 ideas, forethought and afterthought overlaid, or only by being mistaken about diagonal rows beside powder blue could I hope to swathe all in honey. Let the shapes once removed move you. Another interesting aspect of this poem is that slight slipperiness in the narrator's identity. Most people would probably say that the narrator, the I in the poem, is Diebenkorn speaking. You know, she's speaking through the voice of the artist. But that I could simultaneously be the poet speaking about what she is doing in creating the ekphrastic poem. And so that little bit of ambiguity or slipperiness there, I think, is another aspect of this approach that I find interesting.
So this short poem, Summer Interior, is part of a series by the painting is one of Edward Hopper's painting, and Anne Carson writes about a number of Edward Hopper's painting in her book, and it's called Men in the Off Hours. And so the poem I'm going to read, Summer Interior, is paired with this image, but she has poems that are paired with, I think, about 8 of Hopper's images. Also present for each of those poems is a quote from St. Augustine from the Confessions. This one is Book 11. So you'll hear this very short poem, Summer Interior, and then at the end a quote from Augustine, Book 11. Summer Interior. Summer smeared the day. You slid, landing in a strange country. So the contemplative soul. So those dawn horses, half awake in the original green algae, spoke to themselves low, near, and tenderly. The quote, I behold the daybreak. I foreshadow that the sun is about to rise. Augustine, Confessions, Book 11. So this approach to ekphrasis, we have 3 things present here. We have the painting, we have the poem, and we have the quote from Book 11, the Confessions. Anybody know that, Book 11? Know it by heart? No, I'm just kidding. A kind of trialogue, right? Not a dialogue, a trialogue between these different works. And Book 11, which I hadn't read the Confessions, I mean, I read them in college a long time ago. So in preparing for this, I got to read Book 11. Book 11 is wonderful. It's Augustine. You know how he's kind of a cheeky questioner, that Augustine, right? He had his wild days, and then he turned himself toward God. And those wild days, I think, always have enabled Augustine to ask some cheeky questions of God. And the cheeky question here for me is, you know, he's basically questioning the story of creation, because he says, in the Bible it says, you know, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. But how could this be? God has no hands. There is no time, right? So how could you create something in a successive motion, like I exist and then I created something, when there is no time? God's time is not human time. Human time is this manufactured thing that we've created, where there's a past and a present and a future. But God doesn't exist in that time. So at the beginning of Book 11, he theorizes that God had to create an intermediary that actually had the arms and hands to create the earth. Just to say, cheeky Augustine, I think. Because really all of Book 11 is a meditation on time. And what he concludes at the end of Book 11 is, there is only the present. All of us sitting here, we might have a memory of the past, but it's only something created by our mind. We actually don't know in this present moment that the past existed. We know that our mind sort of ideates a past. And of course, the mind doesn't know the future. So Augustine says there is only the present, and that's God's time. Really, this is connected, I hope, to the poem in some ways. So what we see, right? Oh, so he says the contemplative soul understands this kind of only existence of the presence with his God's time. And then even he refers, which the poem refers to Plato and the allegory of the charioteer. Do you know this? Plato's allegory of the charioteer is The charioteer who wants to achieve godliness has these two competing horses. One is a white horse that is kind of moving toward pure spirituality, and one is the dark horse that's connected to its bodily desires and its ego. And the charioteer is trying to manage these two horses to ascend to spirituality. Notice the dawn horses are in the poem, right? The only thing in the poem that has quotes about it, these dawn horses. I'm going to read the poem again and hopefully maybe pull these together. Summer smeared the day. You slid, landing in a strange country. So the contemplative soul, so those dawn horses half awake in the original green algae, spoke to themselves low, near, and tenderly. Notice the stilled image, right? That's what the painting does. There's no past and there's no future. The image exists in the present, Augustine's present. And the dawn horses appear in the poem, but they're not fighting. They're speaking to each other low and tenderly. These contentious dark and white horses, stilled in the present, before the battle of good and evil. No past and no present. And here is this woman who slides out of bed at dawn. She exists for that moment before the day starts, right? And before the memory of the previous day. She's contemplative. She's frozen in the light. She exists only in the present, and the present is collapsed with the beginning of time. The dawn, those dawn horses in the original green algae. So what Carson does is takes Augustine, the meditation, the idea behind it, she relates it to the stilled image of the painting, in which everything exists in the moment, something that poems also do like paintings in some way, right, is they capture something, translate it into the material language in which it exists on the page.
Did you want us to do this?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, so Catalina asked us to bring one of our own ekphrastic poems. Rob and Catalina said, well, you can't just talk about everybody else. You guys have to bring one of your own. So I brought a poem that I wrote after a number of images from a whole series of photographs by Ana Mendieta, and I can talk about her a little bit more later or after. So this poem is called Nexus, and it's after her Silhouetta series of earth body works that were created from 1973 to 1980. This body always compost, hair a plot of thin green stems, snowing a shroud of petals, skin mud-sucked to bark, trunk only timber isthmusing riverbanks, each finger a dirty uprooting. How many stones did I have to swallow before my legs believed their own weight, dropped into silhouette of thigh and hip, a ridge of ossicles crushed to fine white whispers. Offering Quilapan their orphaned pleas, one twin lingers outside the nave, one cloistered in a vaulted niche, its ledge of red roses edging her blood-soaked robes. Meat, bone, a deer's skitter and bolt from the arrow, an iguana's severed tail, spiny tracks. They say we dig our own graves. I have laid me down in a Yagul tomb, outlined my island arms with twig, rock, blossom, mud, our pulse with fire, glass, and blood. I've raised myself in the earth's beds, left this map, this exiled breath.
Want to comment anything about this one?
Yeah, well, Ana Mendieta was both a visual and performance artist. Much of her work consists of ephemeral installations in which her body or its trace merges with the natural environment, as you could see in the slides. She would document them in both photographs and in short films. And what's interesting about her life is, many things, but that she was sent to the United States, to Iowa, actually, when she was only 12 years old, under Operation Peter Pan, which was promoted as a United States effort to save Cuban children from Castro's communism or socialism, whatever, the United States, however they termed it then, right? But which really ultimately orphaned many of these children. And when Ana Mendieta was 36 years old, she either jumped, accidentally fell, or was pushed by her husband, the artist Carl Andre, to her death from the 34th floor of a New York City high-rise. We still don't know if she jumped, was pushed, or fell by accident. Her husband did stand trial. He was acquitted. Many people think he pushed her, but it's not, this isn't for sure. So in my poem Nexus, I'm responding to this series as well as to her life experience. The artist is narrating the poem. The poem alludes to several different installations or performance moments, right, captured in these photographs, some that involve her physical body, some that are comprised solely of natural objects. But I wanted mostly to explore the potential link between Mendieta's childhood exile from Cuba and her strong connection to the earth and the female form. And I'm also moved by the serendipity of her premature death and the various references to death that surface over and over again in her works, as well as I'm also interested in her compulsion to create these ephemeral works that would be easily washed away or blown away, right? And the connection of that to her premature death. And I think that's mostly what the poem is exploring.
Tesoro, for Timothy Trujillo, 1951 to 1991. Just a few years ago, when everything was permanent, or on the edge of, or yes, perhaps over the edge, or falling away from, was like the facades of the Sagrada Familia with their delicate foliage, swans and turtles bearing the weight of, everything alive and carved out of stone. It was my treasure, this permanence, the architecture of living, everything stone true and buttressed, arc and arc and arc of an ancient city. Can you guess what will come next? Can you, touching you like the sheerest handkerchief of silk, when the beloveds fell from the sky and disappeared, from stone to diaphanous silk, on the wind, sudden. It was a mistake, a miss. It was perception of what is light as what is heavy and permanent. Sometimes one's hand can pass through stone, and it is not a dream. One got sick, and another. Someone I loved who loved me disappeared. 2, or is it 3, who died. This is honest enough to say bluntly, this is for Tim. In the visitation, it is beautiful. The handmaid's arms are barely covered, tender-skinned beneath transparent silk. The painter made no mistake. The maiden is the most present of all. She could be taken on the wind with those invisible wings, and she is real, impermanent. Her weight compares to no universe. To hear it in my sleep, Tesoro, the hardest gift I'll come to accept. In the cities of dreams, my delicate arms reach out toward the substantial, to the place where they've all gone. Goodbye. Everything is like thin paper here. Sometime I'll see you all there.
You want to say anything about that?
Well, I guess all I'll say is, I think for me in the poem, really the artwork is like the correlative, right? So the poet, the speaker in the poem, finds in works of art a resonance with some part of this meditation on death, on life, impermanence, right? This very thin veneer between here and there. The fact that something might look like stone, but it is in fact like gossamer. And so that the poem engages with the works in the sense of there's a kind of mirroring, there's a resonance, an echoing between the two. And in this poem, I sort of weave those in as the meditation unfolds.
Okay, everyone hear me okay? Well, this is such a rich topic, and we do want to leave time for questions, so maybe I'm going to have to cut some of my questions.
Sorry.
No. All the examples were extremely fascinating, and just to start with this subjectivity and this idiosyncrasy that you talk about of the approach in ekphrasis poetry, this subjective eye of the poet creates the poem. And I guess my question is this appropriation, this very personal appropriation of an image, what is very seductive to a poet in terms of writing ekphrastic poetry?
So are you asking why is it? Yeah.
Yeah, is this sort of why so seductive to write ekphrastic poetry?
Well, I tend to think of it in terms of, poets deal in images for the most part, right? I mean, there are, sort of movements in American poetry that are quite abstract, but for the most part, poetry is about images, right? It creates them, it imagines them, it concocts them. And so it seems to me a very natural pairing that poets would be attracted to images, visual images in some way. So maybe it's kind of cheating in that you get the image, so you can do a little bit less of the work, but in fact we get to swim around in something I think that's pretty familiar to us.
And I think poets are attracted to ekphrasis, or I am, because it's challenging. It's challenging to write in the sense that you're asking the reader of the poem, Michael Benton puts it, I think it's Benton who says, you're asking the reader to attend twice at once, right? You're asking the reader to attend to the poem, but to also attend to the artwork, whether it's a memory of that artwork, if it's a famous enough piece, the reader of the poem doesn't have to look it up online, doesn't have to go to the museum, will have a memory of it. If it's not a famous enough piece, it's so easy to find, especially now. A long time ago, people would have to actually go to the art museum to find it, but now you can Google it and there's the image, right? And so, the reader, of the ekphrastic poem has to attend to both at once. And that's challenging for the poet, because when you're writing that poem that your reader may have a different understanding, interpretation of the painting or the artwork, may have a more sophisticated understanding and interpretation, may have studied that artist, right? Maybe an art historian. And so there's a way in which I think the poet is concerned with getting it right, to some degree, but also that their poems are working in conversation with and in correspondence with the art. That's another challenge. I think we want the poem to be working in correspondence with the art, rather than just speaking for the art, because speaking for the art is to almost say that the art can't speak for itself. Right. And that problematic, I think, is so inherent in ekphrasis that's another thing that makes it challenging. So maybe the challenge draws us to it as well.
And Loiseau also says that though historically there have been poems about art, she says there's many more in the 20th century and moving forward. And she says that's because as we went from the 19th to the 20th century, right, the presence of the visual image in photography, in film, and those things, right, has exploded. And so she says really this kind of phenomenon of moving into the kind of a world in which visual images are very accessible to us and accessible to us in new ways, starting with the photograph, meant that poets also turned to those images as a subject to write about.
Yeah, it seems to me as well that, for example, with the Lucy Brock-Broida's poem about the Da Vinci painting, I see it sort of as it's against that criticism of the art history that he's talking about all these paintings in this very critical way, and this poem is just so kind of out there. I don't know if this is something that sometimes ekphrasis is trying to challenge art criticism, maybe, or sort of the canon of art history. With what has been said about a painting, and this is what it's been printed in a book about a painting, and that's what people, I don't know, like this is just completely like the reverse, you know. I don't know if that's something that you guys have thought about.
Well, it makes sense in some ways in the whole postmodern age that, right, Brock Broido sort of says, let's remember the context of this beautiful woman with this lovely creature, right? So outside, while she's petting this creature, they're being slaughtered for their pelts and then thrown casually over the chair. So in a way, it is sort of saying, let's look behind the image, let's question what beauty is, right? And so I love that approach to it.
Well, we're also here trying to understand this mode of writing in the context of Latino art and Latino literature. And we did see some examples. Juan Felipe Herrera's poem responding to La Campana by Artemio Rodriguez, and then Eduardo Corral's poem in response to Orozco's the clay heart photographs.
And the Vicuña.
And the Vicuña, and then your poem is making a reference to Ana Mendieta. So this dialogue between sort of contemporary Latino poetry and contemporary Latino art. I guess my question is this what does this engagement with the contemporary Latino art movement? How does this expand the possibility of writing poetry that is exploring these same themes, the cultural and the identity themes?
Well, the culture and the identity thing. So maybe paying attention to that visual stimuli, you know, the artwork that also references those particular themes, makes them perhaps even more concrete, right, for the poet, or more visceral for the poet. I think that could be one element. And I think writing ekphrasis, regardless of the themes that it's on, or regardless of the themes or issues that one might sense in the artwork, you know, it demands that we sharpen our analytical skills, you know, that we question our own interpretations, that we consider other potential interpretations, that we might investigate the artist's life or aesthetics, to see how that knowledge might affect our interpretation. And so doing all of that, I think, deepens one's engagement, not just with the art, but deepens one's engagement with the theme of the art or the subject of the art. And you know, I mean, that's sort of a loose answer to that, but I don't know if you have
another reason that why Brenda and I are here are to facilitate a workshop this weekend at the Smithsonian in relationship to the Our America, the Latino presence in contemporary American art. And so master poets are coming from all over the country to write about works of art in the exhibition, and we're lucky enough to be able to work with those poets this weekend. And so in thinking about this question, I've been thinking about that, is, you know, what's important about Latino poets coming and writing about Latino works of art? Well, there's a lot of layers. First of all, to have this exhibition, and historically, as with many artists of color, oftentimes, right, we're catching up in terms of including many artists of color into exhibitions that represent American art. So there's that, the exhibition. But then having Latino poets come and look at paintings and sculpture and photography, I think, is important, because in some ways this dialogue between the arts is always really important. But the dialogue between artists, Latino artists who are working in one genre, right, who encounter works in another genre, is a very interesting kind of encounter, perhaps as interesting as a person of any background, you know, looking at those paintings. But we're interested in what emerges from these poets writing about these works of art. So, and maybe after that we can talk more if we were to meet, you could all come over to our homes, and we could talk a little bit about those poems specifically in relationship to those works of art. And, if there is anything wonderful to discover about how Latino poets and Latino artists have a dialogue through this medium of words and images.
I think that obviously can't make a generalization about it, but I think that often Latino poets, right, because they're artists, are aware of a lot of these works of Latino art, right? So there's been a long engagement there already, just in having. One thing that happened to me when I first walked into the exhibit on the day that I landed was this feeling of, oh my God, I've seen this work in catalog after catalog after catalog, and I've never seen it in real life. I've never been able to see it in the proper dimensions. It's this large. Or it's a sculptural piece, and I have never been able to walk around it. And to me, this is a seminal piece of Chicano art. I've been looking at this piece of art for as long as I've been doing Latino studies, right? And so I think there is kind of a very personal attachment almost to it. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. Well, and these sort of exhibitions or workshops also bring to light the immense complexity of the terms Latino and Hispanic. We had an interesting correspondence with Valerie, because I actually thought that the Visitation painting was by a Renaissance Italian painter, and so I was going to try to speak about how this poem didn't make any reference to anything Latino, but actually, then she said this version of the painting was done by a Spaniard in the 15th century who's only known as the Maestro de Retablos de los Reyes Católicos. And so this brings the whole issue of Spain, or the Spanish heritage, into the Latino and Hispanic labels. And so I don't know if, Valerie, if you want to sort of speak about, this Spanish reference into your poem. And well, then I was sort of saying, well, the Sagrada Familia is Catalan, which to me is not very Spanish, but it is Spain, of course. But anyway, it's just very complex. So
yeah, I answered by saying, because when Catalina wrote me, she was sort of referring to the others as writing about Latino artists, and I said, well, actually, this is in a way the two references in my poem are, but that made it complicated for me because we've been talking about this today, so I'm very mixed blood. I'm part Pueblo Indian, part Navajo, and my Hispanic ancestors, I live in New Mexico. On my father's side, my Hispanic ancestors came in 1598, and my mother's in 1630 and moved north into northern New Mexico. So I have Hispanic roots, but I have native roots. And so it's just made us talk about these terms, Latino, Hispanic, as you all know. What do they mean in a world in which so many of the people I know where I'm from, around Santa Fe and Albuquerque, are really mutts, as some people call them, are truly mixed blood. And so when we went into the Hispanic collection today, I was like, are these terms even relevant anymore? And so I think in some ways, even talking about Latino artists, Latino works of art gets me confused in some way, because all these issues of identity, or even on the train, I found a buddy on my long journey to get here, and he said, he was saying, I don't even know what the word Latino means. I don't even know what Hispanic means. He's of Indian and Filipino descent, and and he said, and why would you bring only Latino writers to write about these work, and why do we even need a Latino exhibition of Latino art? And I said, we don't have enough time on this train, but we could spend a few years together too. And I say that not to say that they aren't important, but I think we're in an age, as we all know, when all of these issues of identity. There's a lot of fluidity, is there not? There's a lot of complexity and layering, and this is eternal controversy. What is the value in some ways of looking at art or poetry by specific kinds of artists. Is that relevant? Is it irrelevant? And I can't say I have all the questions, but I actually love the mess of it in a way. I love the being in the conversation and the dialogue. I don't always feel like we have to come to some conclusions. I like that we can swim around it and agree and disagree. And so I think that we're going to be able to do that a lot. And I think, what I love about the examples is you see there are poets who are writing, about any kind of work of art, whether it's a person from his or her own background or not. So that conversation is interesting to me. But the conversation about who we are and what terms and is, to me, will never be decided, I don't think, as long as the complexity of this melting pot of a country, which is the best thing about it for me in some ways, right? So maybe they are sort of eternal U.S. questions that we get to explore in ways that maybe other places don't. And so I'd rather love that than be confounded by it.
And we certainly I've written ekphrasis on a lot of artists who are non-Latino
Wow, me too.
artists, right? So the newest poem I wrote was on this installation by an artist named Roy Stabb, who's a Milwaukee white guy. And what I think is important about, and I've done a lot of ekphrasis on the glass art of Harvey Littleton, who was one of the very first people to bring glass art into the studio. It was blown on factory floors, right? And so the designer of the piece wasn't the blower. And Harvey Littleton was one of the people who created the kiln, right? In which they could actually, the artist, the designer, could be the glass blower. And so, and I was thinking about that question too, and I was thinking it's really more the particular art, that's drawing me than it is the identity, the cultural identity or ethnic identity of the artist. And there's certain things about, I think, the ephemerality and the sort of transformation, something transforming into something else, that interests me. So glass, is liquid. Right, and then it transforms into this hardened, right? And if you look at these kind of installations like you saw by Mendieta or Cecilia Vicuña or Roy Stabb, they're very ephemeral. That stuff's going to disintegrate and be gone and turn into something else. And that's what I'm interested in writing about, I think. And so I'm drawn to those pieces of art, and they may or may not be Latino, and I don't care, right? So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested in knowing, so I think there's an initial attraction toward an image, right? And it's sort of subconscious, like you respond to it. I'm interested in knowing if that sort of changes with time, or as you start writing a poem, does the image become more powerful, or has new meaning or less meaning, or does it change?
I'm sure you could get a different answer from every single poet who wrote about an image. Because a lot happens when you, actually as a poet, and if there are poets in the room, you know this, once you get into the material of language, sort of anything can happen. Mm-hmm. Any left turn or right turn can happen. You might think, I'm going to write a poem about a glass of water, and by line 3 you will end up in, Ireland, in a bog, and you don't know how you got there, but there's something about the power of language to me. It has its own, I always talk about, language to me has its own kind of knowledge. It's in my body, so it's like my knowledge, but it's often a knowledge I can't access any other way in my life. For me, poetry, there's something that happens in the moment of putting words together that I don't even know is going to happen. So there's something about whether it's the psyche, the intimacy with syllables and sounds and words that creates a kind of magic in the mind and body that for me often comes out on the page. So that's a kind of mystical, isn't it? But I think there's one, when we give over to language, each one of us, I believe language is potent. I believe that poems are sort of boring if we already know all the ways that words are going to work together. There's something magical about what happens with the linguistic matter that you're playing with. And so I think that my answer to that would be, I think maybe it wouldn't be as good of a poem if I knew exactly how it was going to begin, middle, and end, right? It's all about the journey, and that's what's kind of cool about being a writer.
The discovery. right? I mean, because I don't think I come to any poem anymore with a concrete idea of what it will ultimately become, or what it will ultimately be about. I might say, oh, I want to respond to Harvey Littleton's Blown Glass,
Right.
but that's the only thing I know. You know, and I think it's the discovery, it's the process of discovery, and that happens obviously through the rewriting as well. Every time you look back at that image, you know, and especially if you leave time between rewrites, you know, and then you look back at that image and you go back to the poem and you know, it's a whole new way you're looking at the art.
And I bet a visual artist would say the same thing, right? I'm sure a painter, a sculptor doesn't go into the studio and say, maybe if you do portraiture, you know, but otherwise I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint a barrel, you know, right? I mean, so much happens in his or her interaction with the materials, whether it's paint or the camera. So maybe that's at the center of what it is to be creative or be an artist, right? Is the unknown.
Okay, so I think we're just in time to take some questions from the audience. Anyone has
The
any questions?
disappearing audience.
That was a lot, I think, to take.
Yeah. Maybe we
Well, then I have
overwhelmed
another
everybody. Too many slides.
Then I have another question. Just as an overall, just to sort of to wrap up, what do you think is the advantage of getting out of your own art form into another art form? And I'm not just talking from poetry to painting, but you know, all art forms. What is the advantage to have this dialogue between disciplines and art, you know, art disciplines?
I mean, I think in part it helps us to get outside of ourselves. And I mean, I think anything that's kind of helps us to get outside of ourselves and maybe take up themes or concepts or issues or whatever you want to call it that we might not otherwise engage. We might not have engaged that at all had it not been that we thought about it because of this work of music or because of this work of visual art or, you know, what have you. I think that's part of it.
I just think that art, the thing about art is there's a quality of, that art casts a spell. And so when you bring two together, there's something wonderful about, when any of us, whether we're artists or not, we encounter a work of art, whether it's a poem or a painting, there's a dynamic that happens that enables us to enter that. So I think for me as a poet, to look at a work of visual art, I sort of get to inhabit somebody else's creative space. So I have my own, but there's some sort of projection about that that's fascinating to me. That, you know, we were talking at lunch about, Rob was saying, you know, when you read a poem, you almost get to inhabit the voice of the poet. If you read it out loud, you enter the poet's world. So a reader does that. So as a poet, engaging with the work of art also enables me to enter that world and practice my art. And there's something about the spell of that that I think I'm sort of fascinated by.
You know, I also think looking to other forms of art encourages us sometimes to experiment more with our own, right? Because when you think about like a sculpture or a painting that has a lot of texture, you become very aware when you're looking at a work like that of the material. And it might, for a poet, it might remind the poet, hey, this language, this is material too, right? And so then that might encourage you then, right, to have maybe more inventive approaches, right, to your own art.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, well, thank you, Valerie and Brenda, so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.